So I hope the cameras are rolling, because my mother wanted to watch the part I'm speaking, so make sure that you catch that part. I am not a lawyer, I'm a software engineer, and this is a talk that I by no means should be taken as legal advice. I'm a software engineer that I've been fortunate to work with proprietary projects, open source, free software. I managed to work a little bit with Android, with Linux when I was back in Ericsson, like you. And it felt like maybe I wasn't the best programmer in the world, but I managed to get a set of skills, learn about licenses, and that made me a bit different than the regular engineer at the time. I'm talking maybe 10 years ago. And that sort of led me to start working with, often with lawyers, and try to help with licensing issues, and that's how I started to gather knowledge. And during that time, working with open source licensing, I got the opportunity to try and to work with a lot of the open source scanners or open source compliance tools. So I used Black Duck and Parameters and several other open source compliance tools. And quite frankly, they did the job, but I didn't like them. So I decided to create a different tool, and that's FOSS-ID. So I founded the company FOSS-ID, and we make an open source scanner. But that's not the reason I'm here. I'm here to talk about open source compliance. And this is a 101 course. It's really introductory. I would have liked to start with this in the morning, but obviously there is so many interesting things to talk about, so I was pushed to the afternoon. So hopefully you still have some energy to listen to this. I want to talk about some of the basic concepts that I think is important to set a foundation. Talk about copyright, copyleft, derivative work, that kind of things. Is terms that you often use when you're talking about open source compliance. So I'll be talking about those. Then I'm going to lay out all the different software categories, going from proprietary to open source and free software. And then talk about the new trend in open source licensing, which is software available licenses, which is something very recent. Actually, it's the first time that I get to talk about this. I've done this talk many times, but this is the first time I actually brought this new section, which is the source available software. I'll talk about how you identify the license of the software that you're using. It can be tricky sometimes. I will give examples of using open source and distributing open source. And I will also talk about 2 examples. So I made 2 microwave on a car, and I'm going to talk to you about compliance challenges that you will face building products. One is going to be mixing proprietary and open source, and the other one is going to be facing the challenge of having many suppliers and many different companies that are providing you with software. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about what to think when you set up your compliance process. I think, Ibrahim has covered that very well, so I will spend very little time on that part. It would be awesome that you guys raise your hand and ask questions. It will be much more fun if it's a dialogue. So please do interrupt me. So copyright definition. This comes straight from Wikipedia. Legal right that grants the creator of an original work, whether it is a book or a song or a photo or painting or even software, exclusive rights to its use and distribution with intention of enabling the creator to receive money for a period of time. So you create something, it's protected by the copyright law, and that allows you to make money out of it. And it's pretty cool that software is included within this definition of artistic work. It makes me proud as a software developer. And definitely copyright law will differ between the jurisdictions. So here's me, and I'm going to exercise my exclusive rights. So I found a couple of examples that help me explain what exclusive rights are and how you exercise them. So let's say I write a song, and I decide to give my song to Magnus. I always pick Swedish names since I come from Sweden. I'm originally from Spain, but I come from Sweden. I give it to Magnus, and I say, well, you can play my song, but only on your radio channel, and every time you play the song, you need to pay me money. Right? That's one way of exercising my exclusive rights as a copyright owner of the song. Then I give it to Sven, and I say, well, you can play it anytime you want. You can play it anytime, anywhere, and you don't have to pay me anything, but every time you play the song, you need to say that it's me who wrote that song. So I guess the first example is somewhat similar to proprietary software, while the second example is kind of leading or somewhat similar to open source. So let's look at how it works with software. Then I write a program, I give it to Magnus, and I say, well, you can only use it in video games, you can only run it on Intel processors, and you need to pay me every time you sell your product that includes my software. Then I give it to Sven, and I say, run it for any purpose. You can look at it, you can make modifications, you are free to give it to anybody you want, and you just have to make sure that when you do, you mention that the software has been initially written by me. So now you have a pretty clear example of proprietary-like versus open-source-like form of distribution or exercising exclusive rights. Now, the next concept I want to cover, which we're going to be talking a lot, is derivative work. So it is the expressive creation that includes major copyright-protected elements of an original work, artistic work. To the left, we have Mona Lisa, La Gioconda, from Leonardo da Vinci. And to the right, hundreds of years later, Marcel Duchamp made a derivative work. It took the painting, added a little mustache, and it added some initials here, LHOOQ, which maybe Benoit, Lucian, you can explain what that is, if you know. Okay, I was counting on you guys being able to pronounce it. It's about saying that she has a beautiful behind or something like that, something rude. And he decided to do that. And this is like the number one example, I think, that is being used when explaining derivative work. And it's important to mention that copyright protection lasts for a period of years. It depends on jurisdiction. In this case, the author's life plus 30 or 70 years is what's used in the US, as well as Sweden. So in this case, well, there was no copyright law at the time Leonardo da Vinci did this painting, but if there was, it would have already ended the protection of copyright. So Marcel Duchamp is certainly free to do whatever he wants with the work from Leonardo da Vinci. If we take derivative work concept and apply it to software, it sort of works the same way. You take on the left-hand side, we have a Java class, and this Java class simply returns the date. And if you take that class and you just add out a couple of lines of code, a couple of printouts in this case, it is a very simplistic or very simplified example of derivative work. You take a piece of software, you make small modifications, it is derivative work of the original. Copyleft, sometimes talking to developers, there's this strange idea of that copyleft is the opposite of copyright, which couldn't be more wrong. So copyleft is a play on the word. First of all, it's a type of licenses within the whole open source spectrum that I'm going to talk about more later. There is, on the left-hand side, you have copyright, as I mentioned before, the legal right that grants the creator the ability to make money selling your work. And on the right-hand side, it is using the legal structure of copyright to allow anybody to freely redistribute and modify copies of the work. So it's essentially using copyright law to allow anybody to do whatever they want with the work. And the Free Software Foundation is behind that, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. So now that we've covered the basic concepts, I realized that I missed one that I wanted to mention. So when we talk about open source compliance, I think it was one of you guys that asked before, compliance, we are only referring to compliance from the open source licensing perspective. So when you build a product, there's plenty of software. That software could be commercial, proprietary, and there could also be open source components in it. Those components or packages or libraries are released under a license, and that license have obligations that you need to fulfill in order to be compliant. So that's what we refer to as open source compliance. So you make sure you fulfill all the obligations of the licenses of the software that you're using. And they can vary very much. Can be from, some of them will force you to release the source code, others will just encourage you, not encourage you, but force you to do attribution or credit the author and things like that. We'll talk about that more in depth in some examples later. All right. So license categories. So you first have to split on two groups. It is either copyright protected or not. And if it is not, it is in the public domain. And the two ways that it can get to the public domain is that it's either anonymous authorship or the copyright protection has ended. And anonymous authorship can be kind of tricky. Certain jurisdictions will not allow you to do such things. So it really depends on the country. But yeah, that's the only way something is in the public domain. So either the copyright protection expired or it was released anonymously in the first place. There is a lot of code under the public domain. And some companies have problem using this type of software. If the software is copyright protected, then it's either open source or is proprietary. And within the open source group, there is sort of you often refer to all of it as open source, but there's two movements or two subcategories within that I would refer to as free software or copyleft and open source or permissive licenses. And there's a lot of words for it, but essentially there are two fairly different categories of licenses, and I'm going to talk about these two a lot. I'm going to have now a lot of slides where I explain the difference between them because it's very important to understand those differences so that it can help you define a good open source compliance policy in your company, and it will also help you be compliant with those licenses. And often open source is referred to as FOSS or FLOSS or OS. FOSS, there's a lot of companies like ourselves, FOSS ID, free and open source software. That's what it stands for. And I like to believe it's a bit more accurate way of referring to open source. And when you say free and open source software, and there's also the possibility of referring to it as free libre open source software, which is FLOSS, and then OS, which is open source software. But you'll see those acronyms quite commonly. All right, so we have to the left free software or copyleft, and to the right, open source or permissive licenses. Once again, oftentimes people refer to all of it as open source, but we're going to make the distinction so we better understand the different categories of licenses. Free software is governed by the Free Software Foundation, and open source or the permissive licenses mostly by Open Source Initiative. There you can see the logos and examples of licenses. I guess all of them or most of them probably sound familiar. The GPL, AGPL, MPL or Mozilla Public License, Eclipse Public License, examples of copyleft licenses, while the permissive licenses are BSD, MIT, Apache, and there are many others. Copyleft, also known as restrictive, protective, reciprocal. Yeah, so many names to refer to the same thing. And then permissive or non-copyleft is how you often refer to those licenses to the right. Both the Open Source Initiative and the Free Software Foundation keep their own list of approved licenses. And sometimes they differ. So you can have a license in both lists, and sometimes there are licenses that are just in one of the lists. Free Software Foundation started in '85 by Richard Stallman. And the Open Source Initiative started much later in '98 by Eric Raymond and Bruce Perens. I think if I were to describe them myself, this is my own opinion, I see that they are obviously both of them non-profit organizations, but I see the Free Software Foundation as is an organization that defends the rights of all software users, while the Open Source Initiative is more about educating and defending open source. I think they wouldn't be upset if I say that they are software activists when I refer to the Free Software Foundation. I think they probably call themselves free software or software activists. An open source initiative is much more, I guess, business friendly, and it's more about promoting this model of development of software for companies because it's very efficient and very smart way of doing it. The way free software is defined by Richard Stallman and the entire Free Software Foundation is that it's software that ensures the 4 freedoms. And because he's an engineer, he starts by freedom 0, 1, 2, and 3. So he starts counting by 0, like we engineers do, and run the software, freedom to run the software for any purpose, freedom to study the software, which means you have access to the source code, freedom to share it with whoever you want, and modify it and share those modifications. So those are the 4 freedoms that you're going to hear all over the place when you see free software foundation people. It makes sense. And bear in mind, it's important. Sometimes people forget about the first one of the freedoms. Run it for any purpose. It means it doesn't have to be good. It can be bad. It has to be any purpose. So no restrictions on how you can use or run the software. Even if you want to make bombs with it, whatever it is that you want to do, it should be free. And obviously, there is jurisdictions that will play a role and will prevent you from doing such things with software. But I think the essence is that there is no restriction on how you can use the software. I think that's very important. So these are the 2 guys. I think in order to understand the 2 categories of licenses, I think it's a good exercise to just look at people that started each movement. And Richard Stallman it really is a hippie. I was captivated by his talk in the university where I was studying back in Spain. I was maybe 20 years old, and he did a talk in Spanish, by the way. He speaks perfect Spanish, and he was rolling around the floor trying to make a point. I can't remember, but it certainly really captured our attention, and many of us were very much interested in free software ever since. And yeah, it was quite a life-changing moment for me, at least. And if we look at Eric Raymond, he's very famous for having released Netscape's source code. And he's a guy that really also defends proprietary software, something that you will never hear from Richard Stallman. And in order to define them, I find these 2 quotes that I don't think they can define these 2 characters any better. The first one from Richard Stallman: a proprietary program puts its developer or owner in a position of power over its users. This power is in itself an injustice. It's really, it's a pretty extreme view on software. But I totally get the point, but nevertheless, it's a fairly extreme view. While Eric thinks that if a programmer wants to write a program and sell it, it's neither my business nor anyone else's but his customers or her customers. And I think it's absolutely fair too. Hopefully by now you have a pretty good understanding of how these are 2 different movements in a way. Some historical facts. I think, go ahead.
Thanks. Janneke from Bosch. I understand that 2 different movements, but I was wondering, since Richard Stallman's movement already existed, what was Eric Raymond missing so much that he really needed to find his own OC, while now they have kind of a big overlap in their lists, and kind of confusing at the moment?
That's a very good question. I wish he was here to answer, but if I were to try to think what it might have been in his mind, I would guess that the Free Software Foundation, like I mentioned before, they were mostly activists. They did not care about getting involved with companies and taking the open source development model to help them make better products and collaborate more and so on. They just cared about the users' freedoms. And I guess because of that, they were not fulfilling the gap on the business side of things. And I guess that gave place to the open source initiative. I hope he would agree with that answer. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think. Okay. So from I'm assuming presentation. From an OSI perspective, I think when it was created and later on, there has been a lot of licenses pretending to be open source licenses. Okay, so the OSI came in and says, okay, we're gonna look at all these licenses and figure out which ones actually provide the freedoms, and in a way, not certify, but acknowledge that these licenses that we call OSI approved licenses actually meet the criteria to be called open source licenses. So they actually manage that process, and the overlap between them is basically some of the licenses that are OSI approved licenses were actually licenses created by the Free Software Foundation. It's like the GNU licenses and so on. And there are probably approximately maybe 65, 70 OSI approved licenses, but only a bunch of them, the GPL, LGPL, and so on, AGPL, are actually from FSF. And I don't know if some of you remember, at some point, IBM had the IBM open source license, and then the Microsoft had the Microsoft open source license, Nokia had the Nokia open source license, and what a lot of companies in the early 90s and leading to the 2000s, they wanted to get their companies open to that open source ecosystem, but the lawyers were not comfortable, nor they probably did understand the open source licenses. So they started creating their own open source licenses. So SI came in and says, okay, let's reorg this and see which licenses actually meets the freedoms and allows the user these different freedoms. And this is how kind of the primary mission of what OSI does versus FSF. Just kind of a little kind of context, I guess.
Thank you, Rahim. So some historical facts. There's the story of the printer when Richard Stallman was at the AI lab at MIT, which he told it himself when he came to my university in Bilbao. So I got to hear it firsthand. And apparently they have this printer that was not working, and he managed to get in contact with whoever made that printer, and he had the source code for the drivers. So he could make a sort of a workaround when the printer would have a problem. He would manage to deal with the problem by sending automatic messages. And at some point, they bought a new printer from Xerox. And after some time, apparently the printer was not behaving correctly. So he wanted to do the sort of same approach, getting the source code and finding his own workaround. But the people at Xerox did not want to share the source code with him. And that he sort of got upset. He thought it was a bit ridiculous that he had already bought the product and he couldn't get access to the source code to improve his experience, which makes perfect sense to me. And apparently this was one of these moments in his life that kind of directed him towards creating the Free Software Foundation, the Free Software Movement, and I think most importantly, really, the Gnu Project. So his first work was the Gnu Project, where he created the GNU tools, and probably you all know the GNU C compiler among some of those many tools that he created. And those tools were used by Linus Torvalds himself in the beginning of the 90s when he was still in university and wrote the first Linux kernel. And using all of the tools from the GNU project, he also decided a year later that why not using the exact same license that this GNU project had, which was the GNU public license, or GPL. And probably that decision was instrumental to make Linux what it is today. So it's a pretty cool story, I think. I think this is hilarious that the reason why Linux mascot is Tux, penguin, is because he visited an aquarium in '96 and he got bitten by it, which is pretty funny. So getting bitten by a penguin, I can't imagine how that would have happened, but and then in 1998, as you can see, many years later, Open Source Initiative was created. If you want to see a much more full of facts version of this, you have this URL, and since you're going to get the slides, you can check it out. It has a lot of interesting facts. I just selected a few that I thought were worth mentioning here. Back to the comparison. Examples, the GNU public license version 2 and 3, the lesser or also before called as library general public license, Mozilla public license, Eclipse public license, and then on the permissive side, BSD, Apache, and MIT are probably the most popular ones. there is a bunch of licenses, really. I've gotten a good understanding of how many when we started with FOSS-ID, and since that's one of the things that our tool does, identify licenses, we are on the ballpark of several hundreds today. I think somewhere around 600. And it's crazy how it's evolved and how many companies or projects wanted to make their own flavor of a license. And really that's been kind of a problem, license fragmentation. I was at the LinuxCon a couple of years ago, and I don't remember who did the keynote, but this was one of the things that they brought up as probably the biggest enemy for open source is license fragmentation. How everybody thinks it's cool to create your own license, but then what you're doing is that you're making it very complicated with the problem of licensing compatibility. So if you make modifications to a license, then you need lawyers to come and review and understand and see if licenses really are compatible with each other. And that's a pretty serious problem. When you have an operating system, when you run Linux, you often have hundreds or thousands of packages and there are different licenses. And to make sure that things work together you have to have some sort of consolidated set of licenses that everybody sticks to and not create their own. But I think that ever since probably the trend of creating your own licenses have sort of stopped. So I think we are on a better situation right now. Some popular projects, Linux has the most deployed OS, GPL version 2, most of it, GCC from the GNU tools from Richard Stallman and his team, Firefox is released under Mozilla public license, and Eclipse under the Eclipse public license. So these are super popular, there is so many of them. On the permissive side, you have Android, Apache license, Apache as the web server, also under Apache license, and then PHP and Python, super popular languages under their own licenses. And I like to kind of lay out the most famous licenses and put them from left to right as the more restrictive versus the more permissive. And when you do that, you end up with the GPL version 3 being the most restrictive, the one that's probably most difficult to comply with. And I have an example for that. So I'm going to show you why that is the most difficult license to comply with. I already talked about license fragmentation, but like I said, so many licenses. There is endless examples of funny licenses that are either very little used or not used at all, but there's just so many licenses. And we come across very funny examples. The beerware license, that if you use the software and you think it's worth it, you can buy the author a beer. Then you have the chicken dance license, where they encourage you, depending on how many units you sell with this software product, you have to do the full chicken dance and then record it and whatnot. So that's, and then the do what the fuck you want public license, being a pretty explicit license text, but surprisingly enough is approved by the Free Software Foundation. So it's in the list and is very much used. We at FOSS-ID have a lot of the knowledge that we get around open source is not because I used to work in companies where I work with compliance. It's mostly, most of the knowledge I've acquired is during the last 3.5 years when we created FOSS-ID. Most of the things that we do is actually open source audits. So in merger and acquisitions, when companies are about to be acquired, we come in and we perform an audit on the software. And we take their software, we compare it against our knowledge base, and based on all the matches, we can figure out all of the licenses that are involved within that software. And we find so many interesting things. And because you always, I'm good about working with a couple of programming languages, but I really don't have the view of how the entire world of development works. But when you are randomly auditing companies, that gives you a pretty good perspective of what is actually out there being used. And this is a good example of things that I was not expecting, and I find more often than not companies using this specific license. At the LinuxCon, also a couple of years ago, one of the guys at Google, I think they mentioned that this license was banned, so they were not allowed to use it, and I think it was more related to something with patents than the fact that it's actually an explicit license. But I can't remember exactly what the reason was. I remember they mentioned it, but can't remember the reason. Now, latest trends in licensing. I think this is really interesting. I'm kind of sitting eating popcorn, seeing how all of this is going to turn out. I'm very curious to see how everything is going to evolve. My point here is copyleft and permissive licenses versus proprietary. There is certainly, there's big differences. So I think you could argue that there's certainly a gap when it comes to licensing models. And that's probably the reason why some projects decided to go on their own, not follow the criteria of open source and free software licenses, or at least follow it to a certain extent, but not fully, to a point that they've created their own licensing model. And that's referred to as source available. The first one is Commons Clause. I'm going to talk about that one. Then the Redis source available license is also pretty common. Well, common for Redis it is, or it was. And I think probably Microsoft shared source is one of the most used ones. Everything started in, I think, 2018. Heather Meeker, being one of the most recognized open source lawyers in the world, she, together with Fossa, drafted this Commons Clause. And it is a piece of text that I'm going to show you in a minute, and it's meant to be appended to an open source license. So you take an open source license and you put that in the end as a new section to it. Look at source available software as licenses that sort of use source code distribution model but do not meet all the open source criteria, and specifically the one that allows you to use the software for any purpose, because it's going to prevent you from to use the software for commercial purposes. So there is Commons Clause, Redis source available license, GitLab also has one, and I think Microsoft, they have the shared source initiative, and I think they have 5 licenses, and 2 out of them are considered not open source and source available. And if you go to commonsclause.com, then you see that all the information on why this clause was drafted and what it serves, what purpose it serves, and it says clearly, without limiting other conditions in the license, the grant of rights under the license will not include, and the licensee does not grant you the right to sell the software. So Redis Labs moved some of their software from AGPL to Apache with the Commons Clause in the end, and they then changed their mind and went on to use their own license, the Redis available, source available license. So they've been changing, they've been making headlines, and there's been so much talking about what they're trying to do, but they kind of pioneer on changing this and see what it takes. They certainly led to a lot of criticism, and they lost a lot of users as well. But of course, everybody's free to use whatever they want. License identification. So when you work with software, you need to make sure you understand all the licenses that are involved with it and all the obligations. And in order to do that, you have to make sure you pay attention to the project to identify all the licenses involved. You have to look into the source code, sometimes look into the directory of the project, and sometimes you have to go to the website. When I started working with compliance, maybe a decade ago, it was rarely you'll find a project where all the source code was well documented in terms of licensing. You often had to go to websites or sometimes even forums to try to figure out what was the applicable license. I think today is very common that projects have proper licensing information in the source code itself. A couple of examples. Here we have a file from Android Bluetooth that starts with the Apache license header. Very common. It's, according to our knowledge base, the most common license declaration in the world of open source. Here we have the open source project, Open Fastpath, which I used to be involved with. And in the root directory, they have a file called license with capital letters. And also sometimes they are called copying, or there's other terms being used, but mostly license or copying. And that includes the license terms for the software. In this case, it's a BSD 3-clause license. And in the case of CLib, there was a time where it was not clear in the source code. Now it is, but you will go to the website and you will find information about the license for the project. All right. So when you are looking at the license that is applicable for the software that you're using, keep in mind a few things. Just because it is publicly available doesn't mean it's open source. In fact, if it is not clearly stated, you cannot assume it, and it's probably safe to assume it's proprietary. I think it was a couple of years ago, GitHub had a blog post saying that 80% of their projects lacked license information, which I think is by far a lot less than that. But it was a problem at the time. I think they've done a lot of efforts to make sure that software developers do select a license for their code, especially if they want other people to use it. Because again, if they don't, it is automatically proprietary, and that it will not encourage others to use it. And also that project include other licenses inside. It's quite common when projects are of certain size. It's very common that they will include other libraries and packages and code in general from other places, and that might be other licenses. And in those cases, as I mentioned before, licensing compatibility is extremely important. You want to make sure that all the licenses involved are compatible within those projects. And you have to be compliant with not only the main license, but also the so-called underlying licenses, or those are inside the software module. Then you have the case of copy-pasting code, which is very common, and I know that firsthand. You just go out and try to be inspired sometimes when you're looking at an error, and you often find user contributions in websites that might help you solve your problem, and you end up using the code. It's a very common practice writing software. When you bring those pieces of software, you might also be bringing different license terms to your project that you need to fulfill. So bear that in mind. One of the things that we see a lot in open source audits is that the potential buyer is interested to see if there are snippets, to see if that would jeopardize the IP of the company that they're buying. And we find a lot of cases that companies do take code, or developers do take code from Stack Overflow, and all contributions, user contributions to Stack Overflow, being the most popular website for developers to find inspiration to solve things and do stuff, is actually the Creative Commons attribution share alike license, which is a copyleft license. It's a weak copyleft license. So, yeah. It's a bit of to be quite frank, is a bit of a problem, because a lot of the code that is present in Stack Overflow, having done many analysis for audits, they actually don't come from Stack Overflow in the first place. They come from open source projects that then have been put in Stack Overflow. So you kind of assume that everything that is in Stack Overflow is under this license. It's actually wrong to do so, because it might have been released under an open source project before. And again, oftentimes it is the case. License text should be reviewed. Sometimes we see, again, trying to tell the stories that we see doing audits. There is this file that we found some time ago, that you look at it and it seems like a regular Apache license text. You start reading and it all looks like the Apache license. But our scanner sort of warned that it was some modifications done. So we went into it and looked at it a bit more in depth, and we found that there had been indeed some commits and some changes done to the file. And then you start looking at those changes, you see that some of them seem a bit harmless, from may to cannot, from provided that unless somebody wanted to change the wording. But what's more worrying is the last part, where they decided to add a brand new section to it, which says that you do not get to edit those files under any circumstances. So obviously that's no longer open source, but it did look in the first place very much like open source. So there are these type of cases as well. I'm sort of halfway through, or a bit more than that. If you have any questions, it'll be a good time. Cool. Go ahead. You are the Python developer, right?
Yes.
That was very generous of you.
All right.
To offer that.
If I were to say make a Python module open source that depends on another Python module, but I'm not including the source code of that Python module. It's just listed as like a dependency or as a requirement or something.
Right.
Maybe it gets installed automatically whenever someone installs my application, but the source code is coming from somewhere else.
Sure.
Can I, for example, distribute my module under the, say, BSD license, while I depend on a module that's, say, distributed under the GPL v3 license? That would, I assume that would put the burden on whoever wants to use my module to check out all of those dependencies, whether they can do with my module what they want. Say, if they want to package it into a commercial, closed-sourced application, my module's license would allow it, but whatever my module depends on does not allow it.
Right. It's a super common case.
Yes.
Yeah. So when you are doing compliance for your product, so if I'm building a product that includes your module and your module is pulling a lot of dependencies, it is my responsibility to cope with the licenses of those dependencies and the corresponding obligations. So it will be ultimately my problem. If you're linking to other permissive licenses or permissive license dependencies, you don't have anything to worry about. If you're including things like GPL version 3, then you are probably limiting the usage of your module, because there's going to be companies that perhaps concerned about that license and they don't want to use it. It really depends on what is meant to be run. But the GPL version 3, as I will mention in a couple of minutes, is absolutely possible to comply with it, but it's trickier, and sometimes it imposes extra work on companies to make sure that they are compliant.
Should I add a warning to my module to warn people about it? Should I add a warning to my module whenever I distribute it, saying like, oh, this is licensed under the Apache, but be aware that this and this and this part, which I depend on, are licensed under something more restrictive?
I think I would go as to add normal documentation on the dependencies that are required for your module, and if you want to go as far as to add the licensing for those dependencies, I would absolutely do that. I think it makes it more transparent. Okay. But again, what I see with companies that they use like open source scanners is that they're after that kind of information. Okay. Not only what they use consciously, but also what dependencies those modules pull. But so they will, if they do the job, they will find out. Okay. But I would definitely add it. I think the more transparent you are, the better.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I was just thinking about your example where code was being published at OpenStack, I think you referred to, and then, but previously the same code was being published in an open source project. Which license prevails?
Oh, Redis, maybe? The one that went from AGPL to Apache plus Commons clause, then to Redis source available license. Is that?
We're talking about code posted on Stack Overflow. That
was
originally
right.
Something else.
Oh, yeah. Well, honestly,
how to deal with this situation?
The way we deal with that situation is, but then it's a really from the perspective of false ID, because we keep a knowledge base with open source for several years. We don't only keep copies of open source, we also know the dates it was released. We have a lot of information about these components, so we can make much deeper analysis. And it's for us, let's say we have a file, we've scanned it, we have a match that is a snippet that is matching somewhere in Stack Overflow and something in, I don't know, Android. We have information in the knowledge base to see which one was released before. So for us, it's really easy. But without this tool, it's kind of difficult to figure out. So
okay, so the first, the oldest one prevails.
Definitely.
The first come to
yeah, right.
existence. Okay.
I mean, the author, it would be the one that posted first. But I mean, maybe there would be a story behind that somebody wrote it but didn't post it. And I mean, I have taken the information that we have from our knowledge base, then we make those decisions. Yeah. But I think it's very common that it's just such a common case that when we see matches to Stack Overflow, we often make sure we double check and try to understand the origin.
And is the date of having come to existence always clear?
No, it's not always clear. I think if you take public repositories like GitHub, they have a bunch of good information about their projects and when they are released and so on. But sometimes they just have like an FTP server and you're downloading stuff and you know the last time it was modified, but that doesn't mean is when it was released. So you cannot assume those dates. So yeah, it depends really on the origin. Fortunately, most serious projects are present on serious public repositories such as GitHub. But sometimes it's a bit difficult. And there's a lot of projects maybe that are more, they follow their own ways and they have their own FTP server, it works for them and they keep it that way. But it certainly makes it difficult for those of us trying to run analysis and investigations, trying to figure out the provenance of the software. All right. Now, let's look at some examples of usage. First, derivative works or modifications. If you take a copyleft component, you make modifications to it, those modifications do fall under the same license. That is considered derivative work, and they have to be released under the same license. If you look at permissive licenses, you make modifications to those, they can be kept proprietary. So, big difference when it comes to making modifications of derivative works of the software. Combining, if you take you have a proprietary module or program that links to a copyleft library or package or module, then whether or not is falling under the same license, it will be determined by whether or not it's derivative work. If it is, in order to analyze whether or not it's derivative work, you have to look at the license, you have to look sometimes at the project. I'm going to talk about it in the next slide. It can be pretty tricky. There is certainly a gray area on what it is considered derivative work and what is not. When I talk about this effect, you often refer to it as license propagation or copyleft effect. License contamination is something that I used to hear a lot and is certainly a very negative term that I hope you guys do not use because it sounds as if it was a virus and it's certainly not the case. So I think the neutral term is copyleft effect. And then when you link from a proprietary product or project or component to a permissive one, there is no derivative work involved. So I think at this point it seems that obviously permissive licenses are a lot more business friendly, are a lot easier to really comply with. While if you want to mix proprietary with copyleft licenses, then you are in a sort of a gray zone and up for interpretation, and you might be doing the wrong thing. I think the easiest here really is to embrace whatever license you're using. If you're using free software licenses or copyleft licenses, don't be on a gray zone. Use the license of those libraries and components that your program depends on, and then you don't have to worry about anything. I think that's probably the best approach. And then, again, derivative work. You take the example of the LGPL, and it's generally accepted, not for certain, but generally accepted that if you statically link an LGPL library, it is considered derivative work, while if it is dynamically linked, it is not considered derivative work. Again, generally accepted. And this is a paragraph of the license that talks about that. And then you have the case of Linux, and this is a pretty unique case when it comes to derivative work, because in this case you have a note written by Linus Torvalds himself, which is the so-called Linux syscall note that is, in case you want to read it, it is under the licenses exceptions folder. It used to be in the root folder, but now it's been moved to that folder. And essentially it says that if you use the Linux kernel only through normal system calls, then your program can be kept proprietary. If you don't, then your program would be derivative work. So I think that you have a pretty somewhat clear explanation of what is considered derivative work from a Linux kernel perspective. But again, this was an additional note separate from the GPL version 2 license text. So this is something specific to the Linux kernel and not applicable to all the GPL version 2 projects. Now, the distribution. How does it work when you're distributing? If I take a piece of free software and I give it to the next guy, then I need to make sure that he or she gets the rights to run the software for any purpose, to study the software, which means he needs access to the source code, share it, and modify and redistribute those modifications if he wants to. Then, if that guy wants to give it to somebody else, he has to provide that person with the same 4 rights, which also includes that he has to provide the source code as well as attribution. He has to mention that the software was written by myself in the first place. So as you can see in the Copyleft scenario, the 4 freedoms are kept along the chain of distribution. Permissive is a very different story. So I write something, I release it under the Apache version 2 license, and I give it to the next guy, and I'm providing that person with the source code along with the freedom to run it for any purpose and all of that. But that person can take that, put it into a proprietary program, and give it to another guy, and he doesn't have to provide the source code. It's not necessary as long as it is compliant with attribution, it's crediting the author. So just saying that the software was written by me in the first place is enough to comply with the license. I'm really oversimplifying, but essentially I'm trying to represent the differences between the 2 license models, and I think it's very explicit. All right. Now I got the 2 examples that I wanted to talk about. There is a microwave that we're building, mixing proprietary and open source, and it's a few different scenarios. I'll be talking about that. And then we're building a car for which the compliance challenge here is that we have many suppliers that have many different packages and so on. So let's take these 2 examples, and hopefully they'll make sense and I'll give you something. Again, you remember the whole spectrum. I talked about the GPL version 3 being the most restrictive of all the licenses, and here's why. All right, so 4 scenarios. I build this fantastic microwave, and in the first scenario, I only use proprietary software. So no open source, no free software, none of that. So I give it to the buyer, and I have to do nothing in my compliance work because there is no open source. That was easy. In the next one, I am including a permissive library. Let's say it's a license under the BSD license. And what I have to do is I have to credit the author, comply with attribution. So I do the so-called notice file, where I do a list of all the components and the corresponding licenses and copyright statements. So in this paper, I'm just saying who is the author and under which license the software is released. And then I'm compliant with that scenario. In the next one, I'm using proprietary software, and I'm using a GPL library or package that my software depends to, GPL version 2. So here I have to credit the author, I have to analyze whether or not my software might be derivative work, and then I have to also share the source code, because this is Copyleft. And there's the 4 freedoms, and one is to study the software. So it means that the buyer, that's the one that's receiving the software, has to have the 4 freedoms to run for any purpose, study, which means access to the source code, and then share and modify. So I have to provide him or her with the source code, as well as documentation and information about how to compile the software and all that stuff. All right? Now, that doesn't mean that buyer C can take the software or the source code of the microwave, make modifications to it, and then put it back into the microwave. So instead of being a microwave, he turns it into whatever, a nuclear bomb, I don't know, whatever it is, they can go and create, modify and put the software back. They can't do that. They can only look at the source code, modify it, but they cannot fit it back into the product. And that was the reason why the GPL version 3 was born, where you have to comply with all the above, plus you need to make sure that the the hardware on which the software runs allows for the user to put back modifications of the software. So somebody that gets the product, gets the source code, that person should be able to make modifications and then put those modifications back into the product. And only then would you be compliant with GPL version 3. So obviously that's much trickier, and it's a whole different scenario. All right. Now, the example of the car, you have different suppliers. You're probably going to get an operating system, and either you build it yourself using the Yocto project, or you have a commercial Linux vendor that provides you with it. Either way, there's going to be plenty, hundreds or thousands of packages that operating system depends on. Then you're probably going to use middleware, perhaps through the Genevi platform, which also includes dozens of open source packages. And then you're going to have applications which could be either proprietary or open source. But you have certainly a list of suppliers, and they might provide you, more often than not, with software that contains open source. So what you want to do here is that, first of all, you really relying on those suppliers' ability to provide you with reports. In this case, hopefully SPDX reports, which is a standard that is meant for exchange of software components. So it's essentially a list and a bunch of metadata per component. The version, the license, copyright statements, and security vulnerabilities. There's a lot of information that you get with an SPDX report. And obviously, the accuracy of that report depends on the maturity of the supplier. So if the supplier has a good understanding of the software that you're using, then it will be a very reliable report that they will be able to provide. But if it doesn't, then who knows what that report is good for. And how to figure out the maturity of a supplier, a great way of doing that is through open chain certification. So open chain being this initiative to help companies understand more about open source compliance and making them more mature on how they use and distribute open source and how they let others what they're using. So open chain is a great initiative, and they have this certification. There's a company in Germany that's even pushing from this ISO certification as well. So I think this is probably going to become more and more serious in the coming years. Anyways, you get that software package, and then you get a report with it, and you have to trust that. And then when you build in the product, you put sort of all of those reports together with the software that you have added yourself or your team, and then you end up with a whole inventory of open source components and licenses, and then based on that, you have to do compliance. Not only compliance, but obviously also security vulnerability management work. So what happened if that report, there was one component that was not added? Then you probably might have open source policies that are being violated. Maybe it's under a license that is not allowed for whatever reason. Maybe, obviously your compliance work will be jeopardized by that, and there might be security vulnerabilities that would go unnoticed because you don't know that that product or that component is added to your software. So obviously these are problems, and even if the component is reported but the wrong version is reported, sometimes the license of a component changes from one version to another, and obviously security vulnerabilities are directly connected to the version. So all the known security vulnerabilities for open source are kept, or most of them at least, kept on the National Vulnerability Database, which is this huge public database which keeps a list of all the open source components, actually also commercial software components, but it keeps a list of all these open source components, versions, and corresponding known security vulnerabilities. So if you have the wrong version detected, you might be missing security vulnerabilities. So this is extremely important. And but going back to sort of finalizing this example, when you are doing this is when you rely on many other companies, there's sort of this trust that needs to be established. The companies, the suppliers providing you software have to have certain level of maturity for you to be able to trust their reports. And yeah, so it can be pretty tricky to do compliance when you rely on many suppliers and they are not advanced when it comes to open source compliance. The last point is set up your compliance process. And again, Ibrahim has covered that pretty good already. A little bit you did. Are we going to get into a fight now, Ibrahim? So let's say you want to make microwave. I stick to the microwave example. So you obviously want the shortest time to market, the lowest development cost possible, and you probably don't want to have any sort of problems with copyright infringement, I would assume. So first of all, you probably should define an open source policy. And that will dictate what licenses are okay to use, which licenses you have to go and ask for permissions, and which ones are not okay to use. What I see from our customers is that most companies that sort of start using open source, they have a very simple policy that, and I hope you will agree, Ibrahim, since you talk to other companies, they allow everything that's permissive, and then they put all copyleft components that you have to ask for permission. That's a really common policy that's pretty simple to implement. I think it's a great way to start, but certainly if you prevent your developers from using copyleft software, this is going to be a problem, because in many cases you really rely on copyleft software. I mean, Linux as an operating system, it is GPL version 2, and not using Linux today is shooting yourself in the foot, because that's probably the #1 thing you want to start a product on. So having said that, you want to create and enforce this open source intake process so that components, when any form of software under an open source or free software license is introduced, it has to go through this screening process. If it is allowed through the policy, then it's fine, you use it, you just make sure that that is recorded so people know that you can have accountability of the component being used for that specific project. And if it is not, if it is something that is not allowed automatically, then you talk to the right people. Hopefully the open source program office will help you get to those people. And then once it gets approved, is added to the approved components. And it is recommended, what I see is a lot of companies have a catalog of all the components that have been approved, and even those that have been rejected, so you can have a reason why it has been rejected. But essentially the goal is to try to not do the same thing over and over again. So if a component is approved, you can go ahead and use it. And if it's been rejected, then at least you have a good idea why, and you can figure out if it is worth applying for it again. Yeah, and essentially you want developers to be able to apply for usage of specific components. For those that are approved, you want developers to be able to reuse them, and even being able to copy-paste code from the internet if it is so that it complies with the policies. And then, yeah, if you do that at the time of the distribution of the product, you should be compliant. If I can share some of what I've learned during these years working with open source, is that I think all of the companies that I've worked with or interact with, they always start and follow the same sort of process, where in the beginning is very difficult to have a policy that is somewhat forgiving, that allows developers to use a lot of components. And as time passes and maturity increases, they are more and more okay with a bigger range of licenses. And to a point that often, I think the most mature companies, they end up being okay with almost all the licenses, except for maybe very specific reasons. I think Google was a good example, as I mentioned before, that they use a lot of open source, and maybe they have a couple of licenses that they are not okay for whatever reason. So I think that's, as you become more and more mature using open source, you are more likely to just approve it all, because really it is easier to comply with the licenses, at least easier than re-engineer whatever it is that you want to use. I mean, rewriting software that is already available and of great quality, it doesn't make sense unless you have a really, really good reason for it. And oftentimes, I guess, there are not many good reasons to rewrite software. So this is something that you should think when you set up your open source policies. And obviously, I work for FOSS-ID, and we do scanning, and this helps you figure out what your products, what sort of licenses your products include. So I have to show this slide, otherwise my marketing department will shoot me. And I have this whole slide deck that I do to talk about your book, Ibrahim. And I'm not going to do that whole presentation now, obviously, but I think a great way, when I talk to customers that they want to set up their compliance processes, I always refer them to your book, because it really is an easy book to consume. It's going to give you a lot of information, and it's really going to set you up to a good start to set up all those processes and have a lot of knowledge that you're required to set up those processes. So do read the book. It's pretty good. And that's about it. All right. Thank you very much. So if you guys have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Go ahead. Hi.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. What I want
Thank
to
you.
know is how the concept of derivative work actually works in the cloud native and microservices world, where we have multiple different components that are interactive with one another. Would the chain of components that comprise a solution be considered a derivative work if it includes, for instance, a GPL v3 component?
It has to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. It's very difficult for me to give you a straight answer to that. Whatever part of the software that depends on that GPL version 3 license would have to be analyzed if that in itself is derivative work, and then take it from there. So it really is sort of a progressive approach. But regardless, if you have if you have a software project and some of the dependencies, among them one is GPL version 3, that alone means that you have to comply with the obligations, at least for that piece of the software. It will be difficult to find out whether everything is derivative work, but that in itself, that's for sure you have to comply with the GPL version 3. And that's the reason why some companies making consumer electronics, they have designed hardware that might have different memories, and maybe a specific memory where you are running GPL version 3 code, that memory allows for reflashing it, while other parts of the hardware that is storing software, it doesn't have that capability. So sometimes they can engineer smart hardware pieces to comply with those licenses, which is obviously a pretty tricky thing to do. But again, you start from there. You certainly have to comply with those obligations for the GPL version 3 library, and then from there on, you see what is using it, and decide on a case-by-case basis if it is derivative work or not. Yeah.
Hi. I'm not sure if you can answer this question or someone of the Linux LF Energy Foundation, but does LF Energy have a recommendation or standard for licenses to choose when contributing projects in order to avoid compliance issues or incompatibilities between components from a licensing perspective?
Hi. Okay. So I'm not LF Energy, but I think I can. So Julie, she threw the question on me. So, so when you're contributing, whatever you have to follow what the project license is. So if the project is licensed under GPL2 and you're submitting a contribution to the project, it will go. It is assumed, unless otherwise stated by yourself, that the contribution into the project is going under the same license. Okay, so now, otherwise, say the project is under, MIT, and then you want your contribution to go under a different license. Number one, it has to be a license that is compatible with the target license, meaning both pieces of code can be merged together in a single body and eventually in a single binary without having any licensing issues, meaning the code under license A or the license of the first body of code can be merged with the code under the second license, and these licenses don't have incompatible terms. So one cannot say you can use a bomb, and the other one say you can. Just a bad example, but that's what it means. And this is the first assumption is, and then the second one is it's up to the project to decide if they want to accept an incoming contribution that is not coming under exactly the same license. So basically the recommendation in that sense is any kind of contribution you're making to a given project, just make it under the project's license. It will make everybody's life easier.
Our thought, if you look at this reference architecture that was presented earlier, there are many topics, and maybe later we want to integrate components where we do not foresee the integrations now. So
yes.
This might be something to think about.
So to that point, I mean, this is where. So you have the individual components itself, okay, and then. There were 5 large areas, right? 5 large domains, and each of these domains had subdomains. And I suspect in each of these subdomains you can have multiple projects. So at the project level, it has to be a single license or a couple, but usually they're dominated by a single license, and some contributions or files are coming under another license but compatible, right? And then typically what you'd have at the integration level is you open up APIs so that other programs can call in and use the functions of others. So I wouldn't worry a lot about the integration. I think I would start, if you're doing a great job at the project level, the integration work would be a lot. It won't create any friction. And really just by using OSI approved licenses, you kind of establish a base layer of compatibility, meaning all these licenses respect the different freedoms. Okay, so coming up to a situation where there's a conflict is going to be really kind of unusual in a sense. Okay, so start at a project level, all contributions coming on this same license, and then at some point in the future, in 5, 7, 8, 10 years from now, when you've developed a lot of that and you need an integration layer, that can be also created as its own component that interfaces with a lot of the other components under a common license. And it can be Apache or it can be something else. But it seems from a lot of the interactions we have with companies across industries, across IT verticals, and and so on, Apache 2.0 is kind of business friendly, and lawyers like it for the patent clause and all of this. And open source developers are very familiar to it. So I would start framing your mind around a license like that, for future use.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. My name is Jarno Veldkamp from Alliander. I'm working at the procurement department and have a question about organizing compliance. For example, for proprietary software, a lot of companies have a software asset management department who manages the compliance of the software. Do you have any advice, or what do you typically see where companies organize their compliance around open source software?
So the advice, I think, to give, probably you've done that more than I have, but what I seen a change was during my years in Ericsson, where I think what started, at least from the Swedish side, because we might have been more involved in the American side of it, but for us was to do the education work, to go around talking in different sites, talking about somewhat similar presentation to this one, and trying to get those that would be interested, that will talk to us, that will want to spread the word, be part of the program, and then from there on, many of them will become champions. And it's through that organization of champions that will manage to change the culture and then make an impact. I think that's how it started in Ericsson for us. You want to add something?
So I need to stay away from this. So I think I have 3 recommendations, okay, if you are in procurement. The first one is you need to refresh and update all your procurement agreements to make sure that any kind of agreement, procurement, software procurement, I mean, you may be making a procurement deal with a hardware provider, but they have software on the hardware. So basically any kind of procurement that requires a delivery or part delivery of software that's coming to you, you need to mandate the provider to give you kind of a detailed list of all open source code coming to you via their deliverable. The component name, where the code came from, the website or the GitHub account, the license, and if the procurement deal is they would deliver you a binary, then if they're delivering Copyleft software like license and GPL, they are actually forced to give you the license, the source code for that. Okay. So number one, make sure that you get all license or open source disclaimers or acknowledgements from the provider, including source code. The second recommendation, also from especially on the procurement side, is insensitize or encourage and push your providers or the companies in your supply chain to be open chain compliant. So open chain is a Linux Foundation initiative that was started a few years back with the goal of establishing that trust across supply chain. And they can do self-certification, so there is, they can go the route of having somebody certify them, but it's also open for self-certification, so it doesn't cost them money. And there are multiple levels of open chain, I think from 0 to 4 or 1 to 5. I don't know if it was created by engineers. If it was, then they start from 0. But basically what it does, it gives you a sense of comfort and knowledge that if your vendor comes to you and says, I'm open chain certified at level 2, it means that they have a compliance program, it means they have a compliance officer, and it means they also have automated tooling. If they come in at level 5, or 4, which is the highest level, it means they have all of that. They also deploy SPDX. They also have different elements of compliance that are implemented in their company. So from that perspective, if you are a procurement officer and you have 2 suppliers and you need to decide on which one of them, cost equals the same. Let's assume the cost is the same, the quality of work or expected work is the same, but one of them is open chain compliant and the other is not, then you would feel a lot more confident in accepting the bid of that vendor. So that would be my second recommendation. The third recommendation is to adopt SPDX as a format or as a standard to communicate open source information between different vendors. So you're starting on this journey, and it's very easy to adopt something new now than to adopt it 3 years into your transformation. The car, I really like the car example because from a procurement perspective, there are something like on any given car that uses software, there are 20+ million lines of code on it. So now when you break that into what code coming from which vendor, you can tell the scale of things. Okay, so now imagine every different company bringing you software, giving you that information in different formats. Some company will give it to you in Word, some company will give it in Excel, some company will just give it to you in an email address, in email communication. And of course, they don't give you all the fields required all the same. So what SPDX does is it standardizes all this metadata into a unified form that is also accepted by different tool vendors, that you can automate that information with FOSS-ID, with Black Duck, White Source, and many other companies. Okay, so from a procurement perspective, I would, number one, just to kind of recap, update all procurement agreements to make sure that whoever delivers software to you gives you all the information you need for open source compliance. Number two, start by yourself, but also encourage your vendors to become compliant with OpenChain and get involved with that effort. And number three, adopt a standardized way of communicating this information. And SPDX is that. So spdx.org is the website. And I think openchain.org is for OpenChain.
So just to add to that, RTE did a study about procurement. So if you go to the LF Energy website and you go to open source resources, at the very top is the findings from their legal exploration of that. If Lucien was here, you could ask him directly because he is the one that managed that. But it is specifically around procurement in the European marketplace, around public sector. So that should help you a lot, and he probably also could connect you with the vendor that they spoke with. If you also look on the resources site, Shane Coughlin did a presentation at the summit in Paris in November of 2019. And so you can hear him talk. And there's also plenty that you can find about OpenChain. And, I am guessing that as we move forward, this will become increasingly important. And with regards to harmonization, just to know that, that one, all of the projects have to come in through one portal. So it's not like projects are coming from all over the place and we have no visibility into it. And all of those projects also exist within a technical advisory committee, and so there is visibility across all the projects. But I think, I definitely recognize that going down the future, that part of our job is to continue to harmonize the fragmentation so that, that as we are increasing our dependencies, we're not also increasing the complexity so much that it's unusable.
I think in your hands, you're holding that compliance book. So there's actually one chapter on SPDX, there is one chapter on OpenChain, and I think there's also one chapter in relation to supply chain and procurement. So I would use that as kind of a starting point. Self-promotion here, but... Yeah, please.
Do exist patents on software? How is that handled? Or is a patent on software always proprietary software?
I'm sorry.
A patent.
Yeah, what's the question?
If there is a patent on software, is that a special license or?
No, there has been cases where companies release software under an open source license, but turns out, that they actually hold a patent, and this is a great way of making sure that your software is never used. So if you like, your software to be used, make sure, there are no patents on it, or if you have a patent on it, then make it available, like many other companies did. IBM, Google, and many other companies, they open up their specific patents on software they've released on their open source license, made them available for the community, and promised not to enforce any of it. So there is actually many, dozens of instances of companies who've done that move. I've talked to the legal counsel of this company. It wasn't an easy job if you want to do that, but definitely doable.
Isn't it the Apache license that has this patent clause specifically included in the license agreement?
Yeah. So there are some licenses. Apache is one of them, where specifically in the license text they grant patent access, I guess you call it, or I don't know the technical word in legal terms, but they grant you access to the patent for the contributions they're making to the project.
They actually say that a license to the patent is implied.
A license to the patent, yeah, exactly. So that's a technical term.
Sorry.
I'm not a lawyer. So, John, that's for you, I think.
I have maybe a funny question. Let's say I'm a young company. I collect code from the internet. I develop my own code, and then I present that to the outside world as a proprietary code, because I don't need to share it with no one. It's a bit gray zone indeed. How to handle that kind of situations?
So kind of to rephrase, you go to the world, you go there and to GitHub or wherever, you bring in different pieces of open source code, nobody knows what you're doing, you create a binary and you start selling it. Yeah. Why? so as a user, you come to me, you say, I have a solution that, and then I buy it. Well, I have no way of verifying it, okay? But I think there are ways that this is discoverable. And there are toolkits out there, binary analysis toolkits. One of them is called BAT. Actually, it was created by a guy from the Netherlands. He's having dinner with tonight, right? So there are people in the Netherlands who actually created tools that will help you discover cases like that. So I wouldn't recommend going that far.
That's what I was.
Yeah, but basically there are, and this is not the only tool. There are other tools that were actually created, commercial tools. I know at least of one in Korea, in South Korea, that was created by a company there that actually a lot of companies adopt. So when I was at Samsung, we actually used the BAT. It's called BAT, binary analysis tool that allows you to take a binary delivered to you by a vendor and scan the binary using that and try to identify fingerprints of open source code included there. And what we used to do back then was try to match what the tool found with the declaration of the vendor and see if the vendor is being honest with us or not. And if they are being, then that's good. If they're not, then they're not going to be a vendor for too long with us.
Now it's called
Thank you.
binary analysis next generation.
Next.
So he moved on. Armin Hemmel, the Dutch who implemented it. So it's a pretty cool tool. You should definitely check it out.
You should know that one bank in the Netherlands means afraid. Vendors should be afraid.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so the acronym actually stands for being afraid.
Oh, okay.
Vendors should be afraid of this binary analysis next gen being used on your libraries.
Cool, I didn't know that.
You know
So,
now.
so we have about 15 minutes. I was planning to do a short presentation, but I guess I'm going to skip it for the sake of time, and maybe continue if you have any Q&A for the next few minutes, and then call it a day.
Just a small addition, when you were talking about patents, the question about patents, there was something that I thought if I had time, which I didn't, I would bring up, and it's about the Open Invention Network and how many companies have contributed lots of patents for the development of Linux kernel, and Microsoft contributed 60,000 patents, which is pretty incredible. It's one of the main contributors to open source, open initiative, Open Invention Network, sorry. So that's a great initiative, and thanks to them that Linux can run without any problem related to patents, because there's so many companies that contributed. And that's something that any company can join. You can join the Open Invention Network, and then you will benefit from the protection of the members, and you will, by joining, also donate the patents that you have. So it's a great way of avoiding the problems related to enforcing software patents, or software patents slowing down the development of open source.
So I would like to thank John for the presentation. The great graphics my presentation looked like amateurs. Thanks for that. So that's the difference between a commercial company and a not-for-profit. We don't have really great graphic designer to work on our site. Cool. So if you don't have any questions, I mean, I'm just going to hang out here for the next 10 minutes, and then...
Are there additional questions that people would like to talk about strategy? Like, how are we going to sell this internally? People bring this up a lot. Are there some questions you want to surface? Tej, I see you shaking your head. Frank?
Perhaps I have a more generic question, I would say. When I've been listening today, I was a bit amazed and puzzled by the enormous amount. I'm not a software engineer, by the way, so of initiatives or publications on GitHub. Let's say I'm looking for something in particular, and I might not find it, nor my software engineer. So what start you doing? Reinvent. You invent with creative people, and then after a couple of years, you find out it was already been done. How can the Linux Foundation perhaps help us if we post, or is there already a manner on posting, let's say, I want to have this feature or that service, and that people who are a little bit more knowledgeable in this huge pile of millions of open source initiatives to find at least a few dozens of them. Of course, we can evaluate which one is the best, because that is probably specific knowledge. But even finding anyone is already hard enough, I guess. At least I'm not doing this. I tried it on Google and I thought, my God, I stopped at this. But if I hear that people invent something and, oh, I already worked on that as well, and I did it also, then I think, I guess communication is probably the most important thing in open source, isn't it? Otherwise, we're redoing everything dozens of times anyway. Besides the big ones like Linux, but that.
Can I add something? Because we just happened to do a survey about that specific problem. So we gathered a bunch of developers, and we had that same question, whether or not you found yourself implementing something only to find out later that it was already in place. And we asked the question of what do you use today to find open source, because we suspect that sometimes it is the case, at least it's happened to us, sort of over coffee, talking about this and started wondering, and then we thought about doing a survey. And I think most people use Google and are pretty happy, but then you probably can ask yourself, you're pretty happy because you don't know what you're missing. Maybe you're getting matches of interesting stuff, but you don't know what you're missing. But I think most commonly they're using package managers, and specific to the type of language or build system that they use the corresponding either package managers. Then there's some tools, there's some commercial vendors that try to do that, and I don't think they succeeded, trying to do sort of a tool that allows you to find things more efficiently. I think it's very difficult to compete with Google when it comes to search engine, whatever it is that you're looking for. But I think it definitely happens, and I wouldn't be surprised if either Google steps up the game or there's something else that pops up. There's been some initiatives like OpenHub that I don't think is very much used. Then there is a more recent one that's called libraries.io that is doing that, and not only to find open source, but also to find things that maybe are projects that might be understaffed, and you have the possibility to also contribute. And there's a lot of things that pop up in the world of open source. There's so many initiatives, and some of them succeed, others don't. But I think you are onto a good question that maybe there is a gap for being able to identify, especially as there are more and more components being available. It becomes difficult to actually find out what you're looking for and make sure that you're not reinventing the wheel. So I think it's a really good point.